Yes, I am celebrating because that intro music is very catchy, but more so because we've almost made it through 2020. But we're here to talk about something else. How does a 4.6 liter 2 valve compare to a 4.6 liter 4 valve or the slightly bigger 4.8 liter LS? Let's find out. In this video, we're going to take a look at a comparison between a 4.6 liter 2 valve, a 4.6 liter 4 valve, and a 4.8 liter LS. Now, right off the bat, you have to be thinking, isn't the 4.6 liter 2 valve at a little bit of a disadvantage? I mean, it's smaller than the 4.8 liter, but that's as close as we could get to compare the two displacements. It's also down on camshafts and valves compared to the 4.6 liter 4 valve. But there is an aftermarket cylinder head, TFS, makes one for the 4.6 liter 2 valve, and it flows a lot. I mean, a lot compared to the factory head, and even compared to a ported factory head. But the reality is it a player compared to the 4.6 liter 4 valve or the 4.8 liter? Now, I've never put together a 4.6 liter 2 valve combination that makes anywhere near as much power as a modified 4.6 liter 4 valve or a modified 4.8 liter. But this testing was done long ago. If you put together a hot 4.6 liter 2 valve combination, let me know about it in the comments, because I want to hear how much power you can make with a modified, seriously modified 4.6 liter 2 valve. Now, in the case of the 4 valve and the 4.8 liter, we also added boost to the equation. So let's take a look. To get things started in our comparison, let's take a look at the 4.6 liter 2 valve motor, although as we'll see, it's not really as much of a competitor for the 4.8 LS or the 4.6 valve version, but it can still make decent power, and there's a lot more of these out there than there are 4.6 liter 4 valve motors. So this is basically the power output of a stock non-PI, the early ones up to 98. This was a stock one. It made 266 horsepower and 342 foot-pounds. It was more designed for torque production. They were trying to replace the 5 liter, the original 5 liter back when Ford introduced this first 2 valve modular Ford motor. And as you can see, even though it was an overhead cam motor, it didn't like to rev. It was designed mostly for torque. It had really long runners. The non-PI heads were not that great. The non-PI camshafts were not that great. It was just not a good combination. So when they introduced the PI version, you can see it makes a lot more power. This is a stock one. Both of these were run with long tube headers, and they were tuned. They had an electric water pump. These were both run with long tube headers. So these numbers are obviously a little bit better. That's why the 225 horsepower motor made 265, and that's why the 265 horse motor makes 300, because of the way that we test them with long tube headers, no accessories, no inlet, and obviously the long tube headers also have an optimized exhaust and an optimized tune. So that's why these make more power. But here's what happened when we did basically a modified version, and this one was actually a hybrid. It was a non-PI short block with ported PI heads on it from Total Engine Airflow. It had a set of extreme energy 274 non-PI cams, and then the PI intake manifold. So here's what happened when we ran a modified PI version. It made good power. We made 407 horsepower and 393 foot-pounds of torque. So you can see there is potential with a stock bottom end, and that's what we're gonna compare to the 4.8 LS and the 4.6 valve, basically a stock bottom end deal. So there is power to be had here, and there's actually maybe a little bit more than this. If you take a look at the flow rate of the ported PI head, they flowed like 240 or 245. And they do that at about 600 lifts. So what you'd want to do if we wanted to make even more power, and if you guys have done this out there, let me know if you guys have made more power than this on a 4.6 liter on a stock bottom end, not something that has valve relief so you can put a lot more camshaft in it, but on a stock bottom end, if you've made more than this, let me know. But what I'm thinking is if we got the right camshaft in this thing, and this was done years and years ago, so there wasn't a lot to choose from, but the head suggests that this thing could support closer to 500 horsepower. So if we got the right camshaft in it, we got the cylinder heads flow fairly well, and then if we put an intake manifold, I'll see if I can dig up a picture of my fabricated manifold, the dual plenum deal that I did for the 4.6 valve, or some kind of manifold that would allow this thing to rev a little bit higher. I think we can get closer, maybe in the 450, 460 range, I'm thinking, with the right setup on a 2-valve, and then even closer toward that 500 number maybe with a 2-valve if we could get the trick flow heads, which definitely are better than the factory heads, and a ported set of trick flow heads are a lot better than a ported PI head. So there's definitely more potential there, but really the what guys did, especially back then, before the trick flow heads came out, is they would go to a 4.64 valve, and there's a lot of potential there, as we'll see. So let's take a look at that 4 valve now. Now that we've taken a look at the 4.6 liter 2 valve, we need to take a look at the 4.6 liter 4 valve. And unfortunately, it dawned on me going back through all of my testing over these many, many years that I don't have a stock naturally aspirated 4-valve COBRA motor. I've never had one up on the dyno. We've had modified versions. Sean Hyland sent us a COBRA crate motor, but it already had cams and it had forged pistons and all kinds of things. So I've never run one from the wrecking yard. I have run a factory 03 COBRA motor, and I've run it naturally aspirated. It came as a crate motor, and it comes with the Eaton supercharger, but I want to find out what it did NA, so we could then find out how much power the blower was adding, and if we made any changes to it. I want to find out what those changes are NA, and then also find out what they were under boost. So we can kind of extrapolate using the NA data on this 03 COBRA motor. I equipped it with a naturally aspirated long runner factory COBRA intake manifold, and we ran it with headers, although this is low compression compared to the factory COBRA motor, so it's down about 2 points of compression. But this run NA with a optimized tune, an electric water pump, long tube headers, and the NA COBRA long runner intake manifold and the stock throttle body. This 03 COBRA motor made 368 horsepower and 377 horsepower, and an NA COBRA motor was rated between 300 and 320 horsepower. So actually what I would expect, given the change in compression and the change in cylinder head and juggling all of that stuff around, I would expect this number to get closer the way that we run it on an engine dyno, maybe a little closer to 400 NA, but this is what we have, and this is what we can take a look at. But I do have a modified version of the naturally aspirated COBRA, and what we did was, if we take a look at our modified version, we can see that we made quite a bit more power, but it's at a much higher RPM. What we did was add now this was a 10-to-1 motor. It had ported 03 COBRA heads on it. It also had a Ford Racing FR500 intake manifold on it, the magnesium one. And it was a dual runner, and we ran this with the short runner version. You can also, it has another set of runners that you can open up that are longer runners that will add more bottom end torque, although it's not quite as good as the factory 03 or the factory COBRA NA combination, but run with basically what would be a head, cam, and intake package on a naturally aspirated COBRA motor. We were able to produce quite a bit of power. In fact, I don't think we even did as much as we could have, because we ran into a little bit of a valve float issue. But this thing made 485 horsepower, and the peak torque checked in at 375 foot-pounds of torque. You can see it's running at a much higher RPM. And even this is not near the absolute limit of what you can do with a 4.64 valve. It has enough head flow to support north of 600 horsepower. And with the right intake manifold and RPM and all that stuff, there's certainly more potential here. But it does show that a 4.64 valve motor obviously can make a lot more power than a 4.62 valve motor. But let's find out now how it compares to an NA 4.8 liter LS. In truth, a 4.8 liter LS motor is probably not really a marketplace competitor for a 4.6 liter 4 valve. It probably was more likely to be a 5.7 LS1 or even a 6.0 liter LS2 or 6.2 liter LS3, but we'll take a look at it only because the displacements are much closer. And if you're going to go to the wrecking yard and get one of those, you might want to have a good comparison, displacement to displacement. So on a 4.8 liter, a stock one, if we go get an LR4 from the wrecking yard and run it with long tube headers and electric water pump, and an open throttle body, just the way that we ran the 462 valve and the 464 valve. A stock 4.8 liter will produce, this one produced 333 horsepower and 343 foot-pounds of torque. It was designed more as a truck motor than it was as a performance motor. Obviously, they never offered a 4.8 in a Camaro or anything. So, but here's what it did. They do take the modifications very well, because let's face it, it's a good architecture. The cylinder heads, especially a ported set of stock LS heads, or even an aftermarket head, they have lots of camshafts for them and lots of intake manifolds. So what we did was upgrade this 4.8 liter with a basically stock bottom end with a heads cam and intake upgrade, kind of like we did with the 464 valve. And here's what happens. It makes a lot more power. We were able to get 476 horsepower and 392 foot-pounds of torque. So it did very well. And what we did was add a set of ported 706 heads from Total Engine Airflow. We also added a comp or a crane 224 cam. It was 590 lift or so, a 224, 232, and a 115, and a fast LSXR intake manifold with a set of long tube headers. This is kind of a typical upgrade on a heads cam intake upgrade on a 4.8. It's even more beneficial on a larger 5.3 because these cylinder heads flow enough to support, much like the 4-valve Ford, they flow enough to support 600 horsepower. So there is more power to be had from this combination. The problem is that you run into available piston valve clearance. Now we could run a camshaft with another, 7 or 8 degrees of intake duration on this thing and push power out higher. The fast probably is going to be one of the better intake manifolds for this combination. So I'm sure that we could get over 500 horsepower using the stock bottom end. Maybe if we milled it, put more compression in it. So there's more power potential to be had there. But, from humble beginnings, this little truck motor can certainly make a lot of power. And it made power on par with the 4.6 liter 4-valve that we tested. But the question now is, what happens if we run the 4.6 liter 4-valve and the 4.8 liter LS? What happens if we run them under boost? So let's take a look at that. After illustrating that both the 4.6 liter 4-valve and the 4.8 liter LS can make good power naturally aspirated, the question has to be, but what about under boost? So let's show you guys how much power these things can make under boost by adding boost to a 4-valve combination. Then obviously we'll follow that up by adding boost to a 4.8 liter. Here is a 4.6 liter 4-valve COBRA motor. This is actually an 03 COBRA motor with cam, so it's not the same combination. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to run turbos on either the 4.6 liter 4-valve NA combination or the modified 4.8 liter, but I do have boost on both of those combinations. They're just two different motors, but it's not a big deal. So let's take a look at what happens when we added boost to this 03 COBRA motor. It already had cams put in it. They were the comp XE262AH cam, so they're the mildest cams that they offered. This thing made 427 horsepower or so NA and 390 foot-pounds of torque. But what we're looking at is how well these things respond to boost. And as we'll see, both the 464 valve and the 4.8 liter, not surprisingly, respond very well to boost. So this is our NA combination. Let's see how we're looking at. And we were able to run the same boost levels on both the 4-valve and on the 4.8 liter. So here's something near 8 pounds. We were able to produce 630 horsepower and 576 foot-pounds of torque. This one had twin 57 millimeter turbos on it and had an air-to-air intercooler. Let's make sure we're correct in our description here. Yeah, it was an HP Performance setup, two 57 millimeter turbos and their big front-mounted air-to-air intercooler. And we have a big fan blowing through that. And at this boost level, that intercooler is going to work really well. So let's take a look and we'll raise the boost up a little bit and see what's going on here. This is about 14 pounds. Power output's looking good. 818 horsepower. Peak torque checked in at 754 foot-pounds. And then our final comparison number is 19 pounds of boost, where our twin turbo modular Ford produced 961 horsepower Peak torque checked in at 889 foot-pounds of torque. So you can see, as we went up in boost, we had a commensurate gain in power. The 4.6-liter 4-valve takes very well to boost, as we just asked John Mahovitz, who runs 1,000,000 pounds on his stuff, and it makes a ton of power. I'm sure up near 3,000 horsepower, certainly in the mid 2,000 horsepower range. So you can make a lot of power with these things. With the stock block, it works out good. They have factory forged cranks, so you can make a ton of power with these. But let's see how these numbers compare to a modified 4.8-liter LS run at the same boost. It's obvious from taking a look at the 4.64 valve, they respond very well to boost, and you only need to look at what guys like John Mahovitz from AccuFab have done with their 4.6 to know that they can make lots and lots of power. But how does that compare to the 4.8-liter LS? Well, the best comparison, obviously, is going to be the original Big Bang motor. We ran that thing at plenty of boost. And we have a nice comparison because we've matched the boost levels with that 4.6, that modified 4.64 valve. So our 4.8-liter was a stock bottom end with ring gap. We added a set of TEA ported 706 heads. It had a Comp 281 XER camshaft on it and a fast intake manifold. And run in that configuration, it produced 448 or so horsepower and 378 foot-pounds of torque. And here's what happened after we started adding boost. We ran two 76mm CX Racing turbos and an air-to-water intercooler. So we had basically more than enough turbo to support the power level that we were running. But here's what happened when we ran it at about 8.5 pounds. It produced 625 horsepower. Here's what happened after we stepped up to about 14.5 pounds. We're talking about 805 horsepower and 705 foot-pounds of torque. You can see it's going up an even amount as we go up in boost, which you like when you're running the turbo stuff. And here's our final kind of matching boost level that we ran with the 4.64 valve at 19 pounds. The 4.8-liter produced 957 horsepower and 837 foot-pounds of torque. So as we can see, they both make comparable power at comparable boost levels when we're starting off with a comparable NA power output, and that's not surprising. They have, comparable displacements. They both have really good cylinder heads. They both have good camshafts. They both have good intake manifolds. So there's plenty of power to be had there. It all depends on what you start with, how wild the combination is, and then how much boost you're going to add. But whether you're a Ford guy or Chevy guy, I mean, everybody's going to argue back and forth about which one's better and which one's less expensive and which ones can ultimately make the most power. But the reality is, with either one of these, you can make a ton of power. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do you think about the comparison between our 4.6-liter 2-valve, our 4.6-liter 4-valve, and the 4.8-liter LS? Here's the takeaway for me. First of all, these are not maxed out combinations. I mean, basically they're stock bottom ends with heads, cam, and intake, the way that the average guy would do it. There's certainly more power to be had if you have dedicated builds. I mean, take a look at what Mahovitz does with the modular stuff. Take a look at what drag race guys do with the LS stuff. There's a lot more power to be had. But I think this is pretty good representation of what the average guy can expect with a heads, cam, intake on your stock bottom end. But that leads me to my next question. How much power can we get with turbos on the stock bottom end of all of these motors? Now, I know we've done the Big Bang on the 4.8-liter, but honestly, I don't think we maxed it out. I think that there's a lot more power to be had, especially if you take a look at what drag race guys are doing with junkyard 4.8s. I mean, they're running the boost a lot higher than we did and probably at a lot higher power levels. I think that stock bottom end 4.8 will take even more power. Now, what about a modular motor? Now, I'm not going to go to the wrecking yard and find an 03 or 04 COBRA motor. That's just not going to happen. But what if we went and grabbed a 4-valve combination out of the wrecking yard, heads, cam, and boost, ring gap, 2 turbos, and started turning it up? How much power do you think we could make from a stock bottom end with a 4.8-liter 4-valve? Now, we've made over 1,000 horsepower with a 2-valve, and I don't think we're at the limit of that combination. I mean, if you get a combination to make 400 horsepower, it doesn't even take a lot of boost to get into 4-digit power levels. The question is, how much power can that stock bottom end actually take? I'm Richard Holder, guys. Celebrating 2020, or at least the end of 2020. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff, and I'll keep testing all the way through 2021.